And now I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Dan Meyer.
Good afternoon, Christina, and everyone online. Thank you for joining us today. As she indicated, my name is Dan Meyer. I'm Division Administrator for the Illinois Division of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Today we're going to talk about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse as we near the full implementation date of January 6, 2020. I want to go over a few things to prepare it, make sure you're ready for the clearinghouse. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about the clearinghouse final rule. We're going to discuss the timeline for the implementation. We're going to discuss how to use the clearinghouse, what actions are required to be taken by the motor carrier. We're going to discuss frequently asked questions, how to register for the clearinghouse, and then we'll provide some more information, additional resources, and some frequently asked questions that we commonly get. The clearinghouse final rule was mandated by Congress through MAP 21. The rule was developed and published December 5th of 2016, and that rule established the requirements for the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. The clearinghouse is identified January 6th of 2020 as the clearinghouse implementation date. The full clearinghouse final rule can be found at the link indicated below. Now, it's important to understand that the clearinghouse does not change the core drug and alcohol background rules or the drug and alcohol reporting rules. Those rules all remain the same. This is just a new method of reporting the violations and tracking the violations so that we can improve safety at the roadside. The timeline for the clearinghouse: in March of 2019, we began our information phase. The clearinghouse website was launched, and you can still today register for email updates on our website. In October of this year, we opened registration. Registration began for people to prepare their user accounts ahead of the implementation date. This is important because between the CDL drivers and motor carriers and MROs and third-party administrators, it's anticipated upwards of 6 million people will need to register for the system. So we have an extended registration period currently going on. Beginning in November, query plans were available for purchase. You can purchase those query plans ahead of the implementation date so that you're ready to go on the implementation date of January 6, 2020. On that day, mandatory reporting begins, and electronic and manual queries are going to be required. Now, this is in relationship to your 382 background investigation that you do on your CDL drivers. As you know, 382 requires that all CDL drivers have a background history check of their drug and alcohol history. Currently, that's done manually. When January 6, 2020 comes in effect, you will have to do the electronic and manual. Then on January 6th of 2023, we will have the system in place for 3 years, and the 3-year post-implementation deadline will allow you to stop doing the manual checks at that point, because as you know, the 382 background checks require you to check 3 years of history. So in January 6th of 2023, you will only have to conduct the electronic query and will not have to do the manual background checks. Now, it's important to understand the difference between the 382 background checks and the 391 background checks. This background check is only for the drug and alcohol or for your CDL drivers subject to drug and alcohol testing rules. Who will be required to use the clearinghouse? All drivers who hold a commercial driver's license or commercial learner's permit that are subject to the drug and alcohol testing program of the Department of Transportation. Employers of CDL drivers who operate commercial motor vehicles, consortium third-party administrators, medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, and state driver's license agencies. Now, on that note, as you may have heard this week, we introduced a final rule extending the compliance date for the SDLAs, and they've got a delay before they have to implement this. They've got a 2-year delay before they've got to be ready. I think it's 2 years. But that extension only applies to this SDLA. Does not apply to commercial driver's license holders or employers. It's only for the states. Preparing to register for the clearinghouse, for all motor carriers, you should make sure your MCS 150 has a valid email address and or cell phone contact information, because we've implemented a two-factor authentication process if you cannot find your PIN number to access your portal account. This is important to do because if we have to send you your PIN, it's going to be done via U.S. mail to the last registered address on your MCS 150 profile. If that is not current, that letter will not arrive to you and you cannot update your PIN number. So everybody should go in, make sure their MCS 150 has a valid email address or cell phone information. If you have not already done so, you should be registering for a portal account. A portal account is going to be necessary for all U.S. DOT numbers. For entities such as school districts that do not use or have a U.S. DOT number, we're going to discuss how they can register later. Then you will need to log on to the portal at the address indicated and then navigate to Account Management, My Profile, and Portal Roles/US DOT number. In there, you will add the DACH Motor Carrier Admin role and must be approved by the portal administrator. There are two roles in there, but you will have to select that to be able to add people to view the account. Then you will need to create a login.gov account to access the clearinghouse. Accessing the clearinghouse requires you to use a shared service that offers a secure online access to participating government systems. This is not just a DOT website, it's utilized across the government. Registration at the login.gov account requires completion of the user verification process. You can verify or authenticate yourself via phone, voice or text message, authentication application, or secure key. Government employees will use a separate process. So that's the process you will use to receive and secure or validate your application with login.gov. After setting up your login.gov, registration will be completed in the clearinghouse itself. You will then go to Step 2, Role Selection, and for all DOT entities, you'll have to select Yes, I have a portal account. At that time, employers will be asked to enter and verify their portal credentials, which is where you will need your PIN number. Owner-operators will be asked to identify their consortia or third-party administrator. Drivers who registered don't have a DOT number, so they will enter their CDL information. MROs or SAPs will need to certify that they meet the Part 40 requirements in order to register in the system. The user dashboard is a homepage for the roles of the clearinghouse activities, including inviting and managing assistants. You can employers can, if the person who manages the portal account is not the person going to be doing this, they can invite in assistants, somebody to manage the data for them or to run the queries. Owner-operators and/or motor carriers can select the consortia or third-party administrators within the system if they so choose to. You can purchase query plans already. They're now available to be purchased. That began in November. And then starting January, you will report drug and alcohol program violations, and then you will conduct queries, which we'll talk about here in more depth in a minute. In all of these systems, MROs, SAPs, or third-party administrators, as well as employers, you can invite users in. Once the account is created, and once the clearinghouse is set up and linked, then you can email the people you want to invite to be your assistants. All assistants have to be invited. They cannot go in and register. If they try to go in to register, it's going to try to create a login through the employer, which will confuse the system and it won't work. So whoever sets this up and is the primary will have to be the one to invite them in. The CPC or consortia or third-party administrator assistants enter the violation information queries on behalf of the authorized third-party administrator. They may support multiple third-party administrators. MRO assistants will enter their violation information into the clearinghouse on behalf of the authorized MRO, and again may support multiple MROs. Same with SAP assistants. They can enter the return to duty information in the clearinghouse on behalf of the authorized SAP and may support multiple SAPs. For the employers, there are two paths as we discussed. If you've got a US DOT number or should have a US DOT number, you have to register through the FMCSA portal account. You will enter your portal credentials and link your portal to the clearinghouse account. If you utilize a consortium or third-party administrator, you will designate them in the system, in the portal system through this process, and you'll accept the terms and conditions. If you don't have a US DOT number or are not subject to the US DOT number regulation, you will enter the contact information and company information, and in there you can designate your consortium or third-party administrators and accept the terms and conditions. I have provided Christina with a full set of registration instructions, but they're also found at the link provided in this presentation. She does have it available and can send it out as requested. Drivers will need to complete the following actions to register in the clearinghouse. They will need to register in order to review their own information. They will need it to provide or refuse specific electronic consent to an employer for a full query, which includes pre-employment queries. They will also use it to identify a SAP before the SAP can enter the return to duty information about them. It's important because drivers need to know what's being entered on their profile. Drivers can submit a petition to correct inaccurately reported information as a part of which was established as part of the final rule. They can request removal from the clearinghouse of employer's report of actual knowledge of a traffic citation for operating a CMV under the influence of drugs or alcohol if the citation did not result in a conviction. Requests for other reports of actual knowledge violations, as well as failed to appear test refusals, can be removed from the clearinghouse if they were not properly reported in accordance with 382-705B5. If the drivers are going to petition for removal, they have to do it through our data queue system. If they go through that process, FMCSA will review the petition and notify the driver of the decision to remove, retain, or correct the information in the clearinghouse and the reason for the decision. If the driver believes the decision was made in error, they may submit a request for administrative review. That request must include an explanation why they believe FMCSA made an error in their decision. The driver will be informed of the decision of the administrative review, and that decision will constitute the final agency action. It's important to know that it's limited what information the driver can challenge. They can only challenge the accuracy of the information reported and the report of employer's actual knowledge if they received a citation for driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol and it did not result in a conviction. Accuracy of test results or refusals to test may not be challenged. An employer will be notified if information is changed or removed from the clearinghouse as a result of the petition. Now, the driver's petition must include their contact information, their CDL number and state of issuance, and a detailed description of why they believe the information is not accurate. Consortia or third-party administrators, as well as employers, need to complete the following actions in the clearinghouse. They first must register in the clearinghouse. They must report certain drug and alcohol violations to the clearinghouse. They must request specific consent in the clearinghouse from the driver they wish to conduct a full query on, including pre-employment queries. They must report negative return to duty or controlled substances test results. They must report the completion of driver's follow-up testing plan, as well as they must designate assistance in the clearinghouse if they want that assistant to enter the violation information or conduct queries on their behalf. An employer who employs himself as a driver, commonly referred to as an owner-operator, must designate a consortia or third-party administrator in the clearinghouse. The consortia or third-party administrator must be designated by the employer in the clearinghouse before they can report the violation information or query the clearinghouse on behalf of the employer. There are two types of queries to run. The first is a limited query. The second is a full query. A limited query is done for two reasons. It's either part of an annual check on a currently employed driver, because they're required to run a limited query on every driver they have at least once a year, or an ad hoc or periodic check on the driver. Now, if they run the limited query, it'll either return no record found in the clearinghouse, which means there's no further action required. There's no information in the clearinghouse on the driver they queried. If there is a record found in the clearinghouse for the queried driver, they must request a full query, and they must request a full query for the violation return to duty details to be released. If the full query is not conducted within 24 hours, the driver must be removed from safety-sensitive functions, including operating a CMV. So if you run a limited query today, and I get a return, there's a record, I have to request a full query from the driver, and if I don't have the results within 24 hours, I must remove the driver from safety-sensitive functions. Now, full query has to be conducted for a pre-employment check on a prospective driver, a limited query, return to record for a query driver, or I can do an ad hoc or periodic full query on the driver. The full query returns full violation or return to duty details for a queried driver. So the required action is, if a driver has a violation and no negative return to duty test, the driver is removed from safety sensitive functions. If a driver has a violation and a negative return to duty test, no action is required. So those are the two types of queries, and they are distinct in how they are handled and function. So it's important to understand the differences of the two systems. Both of the queries require consent on behalf of the queried driver. For a limited query, they have to give consent for the annual check or the ad hoc or periodic check on the driver. That consent is contained outside of the clearinghouse. It may be electronic or a wet signature. Our website does contain a sample limited query consent form, but you are not required to use it. It is merely provided as a sample. The key takeaway is that the limited query consent must specify a time range. An employer cannot have an open-ended limited query authorization from the driver. It must be for a specific time period, and it must be valid or must indicate what that time range is. If the driver refuses to give signed consent for the limited query, the query cannot be conducted, and the driver must be removed from safety-sensitive functions. If the driver does give a signed consent, that paper or electronic version must be retained in the driver qualification file and must be utilized to request limited queries in the clearinghouse. Now, when that does, as we talked about, it has to be for a limited specified time range. If it does expire, you must renew it and put it in the driver qualification file. Now, full query is for a pre-employment check on a prospective driver, a limited query that returned information exists on the query driver, and now you have to run the full query, or an ad hoc or periodic check on the driver. That consent is provided electronically within the clearinghouse and is tracked within the clearinghouse. It must be done for each. The consent is good for just that one query. So if you have hired me, you run a full query on me for my pre-employment, and you found data in there, but it says I'm okay to drive. If you're going to run my annual, you're probably going to want to run a full query because you already know a limited query is going to return data. So at my annual or ad hoc time, you would want to run a full query because you already know information is going to be in the system. Now, if consent is refused in the system, meaning the driver does not give consent, the employer is notified that the driver has refused to give consent, the full query cannot be conducted, and the driver must be removed and cannot perform safety-sensitive functions as of the time of the notification of refusal. If the consent is provided by the driver, the query will be conducted and the violation details will be released, including the return to duty status. And if the query driver has a violation and no negative return to duty status test, the driver must be removed from safety-sensitive functions. Now, everybody should consider how this impacts your driver qualification file and how it's going to impact your application file for new drivers. So if you are going to hire a new driver after January 6th of 2020, you know you're going to have to run a full query. I would probably consider putting something on the application or separate process when you are down to the decision that you want to run the full query. Has the driver registered with the clearinghouse? Because if they haven't registered, it's going to delay the process. So you want to start thinking about this in your hiring process. I don't know where you want to ask it, but that's something everybody's going to have to decide how they want to handle it. For your driver qualification file of the employees you hire, you're going to have the full query in there if you hired them after January 6th of 2020. Then somewhere between now and January 5th of 2021, there should be an annual query in there. And I should also have the proof that I have limited consent for the limited queries. I have a signed consent form for the limited query checks. So you're going to need to have those documents in there as you go forward in your driver qualification files. Reporting to the clearinghouse. Every employer or designated third-party administrator is required to report an alcohol confirmation test with that concentration of 0.04 or higher. They must report refusal to test for alcohol as specified in Part 40. They must report refusal to test for drugs not requiring a determination by MRO as specified in Part 40. They must report actual knowledge as defined in 382.107 that a driver has used alcohol on duty, used alcohol within 4 hours of coming on duty, used alcohol prior to post-accident testing, or has used a controlled substance. They also must report negative return to duty testing for drug and alcohol testing as applicable, and they will also report the completion of any required follow-up testing. All of this information must be reported to the clearinghouse by the close of the 3rd business day following the situation. How much are queries going to be? Well, every query is going to cost a flat rate of $1.25 per query. You can purchase them in bundles as indicated on this slide. If you want to, if you're a large enough company and want to make one annual payment, we will accept an annual payment of $24,500 for unlimited queries. Now, if you do the math, that works out to 19,600 queries. So if you're a very large company, 20,000 drivers or more, that's probably the way to go. Now, if you purchase an annual payment plan because you're an exceptionally large company, that is only good for 1 year from the date of the purchase. It expires after 12 months. If you purchase a query plan of 5,000 queries, those never expire. They are good until you use all 5,000. So that's the key difference between those two systems on how you're going to run your queries and how you're going to pay for them. Why purchase a query plan? Because every employer is going to be charged a fee conducting a query through the clearinghouse. They must be purchased through a query plan if they are going to run the queries or if they're going to have the third-party administrators conduct the queries. The third-party administrators cannot purchase query plans because they have to run them through the employer that purchase the plans. So you would allow your third-party administrator to utilize the queries you have purchased. An employer can purchase the query plans only through our Clearinghouse website. You're just going to have to decide what query plan works best for you. Do you want to purchase everything you're going to need for a year, for 6 months? It's going to be based on your current needs. You know, for every driver you've got, you're going to have at least one annual query within a year, and any planned applicants that you want to screen for hiring are going to have a query for those. The good news is if you purchase under purchase, you can add more as needed. If you over purchase, they're still good. And as we talked about, the high volume users do have the unlimited query, but it is only good for 365 days. Query plans are currently available for purchase. Medical review officers and substance abuse professionals, they must work for an MRO company or be self-employed. The MROs must register for the clearinghouse, complete the verification process. They must enter the drug and alcohol drug violation in the clearinghouse, and they can designate assistants to enter the violations on their behalf. SAPs must work for a SAP or be self-employed. They must register for the clearinghouse. They must register return to duty information into the clearinghouse, including the date of initial assessment completed and the date the driver is eligible for a return to duty test, and they may designate assistants to enter the information on their behalf. All assistants must be invited into the clearinghouse by the MRO or SAP. Drivers must identify the SAP in the clearinghouse before the SAP may enter the return to duty information. Now, it's important to understand, as an employer, if you have a driver, excuse me, if you have a driver who has tested positive, you must still provide them, you are still required to provide them a list of SAPs in their area that can assist them with their return to duty testing. A driver should establish a relationship with a SAP before making the SAP selection in the clearinghouse. They shouldn't select a SAP first and then go seek them out. They need to establish that relationship, then select a SAP in the system, then the SAP can enter the information in the clearinghouse. Excuse me. An MRO is required to report verified, positive, adulterated, or substituted drug test results. They must report refusal to test drugs requiring a determination by the MRO as specified in Part 40, and they must report changes to a verified drug test. Now, the first two must be reported within 2 business days of making the determination or verification of a DOT-approved drug test. Any changes to a verified drug test must be made within 1 day. SAPs must report the identification of driver and date of initial assessment that was initiated by the close of the business day following the initial assessment. They must also enter the date of determination of eligibility for the return to duty testing by the close of the business day following the determination that the drivers completed the return to duty process. Will violations that occur prior to January 6, 2020 be reported? No. This is from the January 6th date forward only, which is why we have the 3-year delay before you can eliminate the manual background checks. The information is retained in the system for 5 years unless the return to duty testing or follow-up testing is not completed. Then it will be retained indefinitely until successful testing is completed. Now, if a driver goes out, they get a positive test, and they say, that does it, I'm not going to drive anymore, and doesn't ever complete the return to duty testing, it will stay in there. So if 7 years later they want to return, it's still going to be in there, and they're going to have to complete the return to duty process. Well, if they do complete the return to duty process and complete the follow-up testing, the information is retained in there for another 5 years. So at a minimum, you will be able to see it 5 years after the follow-up testing is completed. Prospective employees' drug and alcohol history with other modes will not be in the clearinghouse. The regulation is very clear that it must fall under the purview of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations. Does every driver need to register for the clearinghouse? Well, no, unless they want to hire or try to select another job, or if they ever test positive. So if a driver's been with the company for forever, they have no intention of going anywhere, they're absolutely positive they're not going to use CBD oil or any other illicit drug, then they don't have to register. But if they ever incur drug and alcohol violation or ever seek other employment, they will have to register into the clearinghouse to be able to do that. An employer cannot ever register their drivers in the clearinghouse. Although this is not under the Fair Credit Reporting, it is subject to the Fair Credit Reporting privacy rules. So you cannot enter information for them. They must register themselves. Now, an employer may provide a computer. They may educate the driver on how to set up an email address, because they will need an email address. They can help them with that. They can provide the process for them to do it. They just cannot do it themselves. Employers of non-CDL drivers who operate CMVs are not required to query the system. Additionally, if you operate non-CDL vehicles and you have a CDL driver that's not utilizing the CDL for operation and is not subject to drug and alcohol testing, you do not need to query them either. This only applies to those CDL drivers who are subject to drug and alcohol testing. Can an employer or MRO enter the program violation if the driver is not registered? Yes. The driver being registered within the system is not required for a violation to be entered. The violation is entered based upon the driver's CDL information, and that's how they will be tracked within the system. Will an employee be notified if a violation is recorded on a previously queried driver? They will receive a notification if a new violation is recorded on a query driver within 30 days of conducting the pre-employment query only. That's a 30-day look back. The employer must receive additional electronic consent from the driver before a full query can be conducted to view the detailed information. But if you run a limited query or an ad hoc query, you will not get that 30-day look back. That 30-day look back only applies to pre-employment. The thought being that if they're applying with you, they're probably applying elsewhere. And so if they've applied at somebody that did not hire them and there's a drug and alcohol violation detected, this will provide you that same information. That's why we have a 30-day look back on pre-employment. But as we stated, for the limited, annual, or the ad hoc full query, there will not be the 30-day look back. Canadian drivers and Mexican drivers conducting operations in the United States are subject to the clearinghouse requirements, and they must comply. Canadian and Mexican employers must report drug and alcohol violations to the clearinghouse for anybody operating, if they operate within the United States and are required to follow the FMCSA drug and alcohol testing requirements. Can an employer select and designate more than one consortium or third-party administrator? Yes. And who can record the positive alcohol test results for an owner-operator? It has to be the designated consortium or third-party administrators responsible to record the violation information regarding the owner-operator. Now, an owner-operator can view and query their own information, but they cannot enter the violation. That has to be done by the third-party administrator or consortium. The owner-operator is required to self-identify as an owner-operator and required to designate the consortium or third-party administrator to access their clearinghouse. A driver's follow-up testing plan will not be available in the clearinghouse. It's not uploaded into the system. It is not put in there. So if you hire somebody who is currently in a follow-up testing program, you're going to have to contact the SAP yourself to get that information so that you can continue with the testing plan. So if they have not completed the testing plan, it's not going to be here. You're going to have to obtain it as required. The follow-up testing will not be tracked in the clearinghouse either. However, if there's a positive follow-up test result, it must be reported as a new violation, and the return to duty process is reinitiated after that violation is entered into the system. Will an application programming interface be available? No. We're not going to do that. Our website functionality is app friendly, so we're not launching an API right now. We may consider it in the future. However, we do have bulk query functionality available. There is a template provided on the Clearinghouse website, so if you have a large number of drivers to run, you can put it into the template and run all of your drivers at one time. The Clearinghouse is mobile friendly, as I stated. Drivers will be able to access the Clearinghouse from the smartphone or log in and view the information, as well as provide consent to identify their substance abuse professional, if applicable, through a smartphone. The driver's social security number or employee identification number is not required to report violation in the Clearinghouse. As I stated, the employer must utilize a driver's CDL number and state of issuance. The driver, because that's what's on the control and custody form or the alcohol testing form. We don't use the driver's social security number. All that's been removed with the forms being updated. And there are FAQs and other outreach materials available on the Clearinghouse at the website indicated below. It's updated regularly with new information. There's also the information on the instruction list or instruction sheet on how to register is available on there for employers, as well as through Christina if you contact her. So what you need to do now is, as a company, you need to register yourself, or drivers need to register themselves. Educate your drivers that they should register instead of registering in the Clearinghouse. Employers, especially owner-operators, must designate a consortium third-party administrator, and employers, third-party administrators, SAPs, and MROs can set up assistance unless they're going to do it themselves, but most importantly, encourage your drivers to register in the system. Additional information is available on our website. As I indicated earlier, you can subscribe for email updates. We do have frequently asked questions, which are constantly changing. There are Clearinghouse fact sheets, or fact sheets for MROs, for SAPs, for employers, for drivers. There are user roll cards and brochures on how to utilize the system and how it impacts each of those groups. If you have if you request any information or need any further information, you can contact us at the email address below, or you can contact me through Christine. That's all I've got on information. I'll open it to questions now if anybody's got any.
Well, and as we wait for any questions to come through, I would just like Dan to thank you sincerely for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us to help our clients through this process. The documents that you mentioned will be in an email after either later this afternoon or more probably tomorrow, along with the PDF PowerPoint that Dan shared with me as well. So you can go through this more slowly at your own pace. I do want to remind everyone that the Corkill Safety Department is staffed with fleet professionals that have DOT and fleet safety experience. We can help you with your written policies, driver qualification requirements, monitor your SMS numbers, accident analysis, and safety consulting on an as-needed basis. We do have also several vendor alliances. We have 3 right now, one with J.J. Keller, who will offer a 10% immediate discount on their products. So if anyone is interested in that. So I have a question. We only have 3 drivers with CDLs. Are we required to register with the Clearinghouse?
If they're subject to drug and alcohol testing, yes. Because as an employer, you're going to have to run an annual query at a minimum. And speaking of annual queries, something to keep in mind, a lot of people, you already have to run an MVR annual, check annually. And some people may want to consider tying this query to that and do it at the same time. Some companies elect to do it on the driver's birthday so that they've got some trigger. Some do it on a regular basis, however you do it. But one thing to keep in mind, if you run a limited query on January 15th, the odds of there being anything in the system are remote. So for the first year, you only have to run the annual query prior to January 5th of 2021. So you may want to delay that annual limited query until later in the year when there's the potential for something to be in the system. You don't have to, but it is a requirement that you run it annually. And so for that reason, all employers and employed CDL drivers subject to drug and alcohol testing are going to have to be registered to do those checks, even if you have somebody else do it. Because you have, as we stated, you have to purchase the query plans. The third-party administrator cannot.
Another person asked, you mentioned that some of the drivers, if they don't plan on leaving the company, do not have to register. I thought everyone was required to register.
They're encouraged to register. But if they're not going to leave the company and they never test positive for anything, then there's no requirement that a driver must register. But if they test positive, they're going to be behind the eight ball, so to speak, in the process because they can't access the information. They also will not be able to access the information in the system if they feel it's been reported erroneously. Now, due to the privacy concerns of the driver, if we have information if we find out information is entered on a driver that is not registered, we will still contact that driver by U.S. mail. So they will be still notified even if they're not registered. But registration is the fastest way for them to check their own data and to work within the system. But if they're going to apply somewhere else, they can't. There's no way they can approve any other employer doing their full query without being registered in the system.
Okay, thank you. All drivers of our company are owners of the business with no outside employees. We do not go over the road and deliver, or it must mean we do go over the road and deliver loads within a 50-mile radius, so short haul. So are we required to register?
If they're operating commercial vehicles over 26,000 and they need a CDL, you're subject to the drug and alcohol testing. Mileage does not enter into the equation when determining drug and alcohol testing. So if you are subject to the drug and alcohol testing, then yes, you must be registered as an employer.
Okay, and then someone asked if you're going to get a copy of the notes. Yes, you will. So you'll get an email either later this afternoon or tomorrow, and that will have the documents that Dan talked about, as well as a copy of the slides. All right, here's a long question. Our company does post-accident DOT drug testing. In the event that a current driver that is not planning on leaving the company and didn't register, I can still do the testing, and if they test positive, then will they be required to register? Well, so if someone has not registered and then has an accident and is tested because of a post-accident, are they required to register at that time?
Okay, when they test positive, if it's for drugs, the MRO is going to enter it. If it's alcohol, it's going to be the employer that's going to enter it. If the driver is not registered in the system, they cannot complete the return to duty process. So if they're going to get out of trucking, they don't have to register, but they cannot return to a CDL operation requiring drug and alcohol testing without registering and completing the return to duty process. That has to be done within the system, has to be reported in the system. So the employer will report it. It cannot get cleared off of the driver's CDL until he or she registers and completes the process.
Very good. A driver does not have to register, but all companies and businesses must register. That's a question.
Yes. And anybody employing CDL drivers, as we talked about, school districts, state departments of transportation that operate commercial vehicles, they've got to be registered because they're going to have CDL drivers subject to drug testing.
Okay, that seems to be the end of the questions. So Dan, I want to thank you once again for taking time out. Oh, we have one more. How can I perform a query on an employee if they are not registered?
You can still run a query on the employee that's not registered because their registration doesn't put them in the system. The positive test or the return failure to test, any of those conditions that require reporting into the system is what triggers entry into the system. Has nothing to do whether the driver's registered or not. I've got a CDL. I'm operating a commercial vehicle subject to drug testing. I either fail a test or refuse a test. You as the employer or MRO are going to enter my information based upon my CDL and my state of issuance of my CDL. That information's in there, whether I'm registered or not. So it has nothing to do with whether the driver registers before the information is there. It's based upon the input of the data.
Has there been any correspondence to CDL drivers to inform or encourage them to register?
No specific to each driver. It's been a public education campaign. It's on our website. We've been talking about this now for going on almost 6 months. Anywhere we go out and talk, employers notifying their drivers is going to be the fastest way to encourage them to register in the system.
And a question, can you make a driver register?
No. You cannot force them to register. If they elect not to, they just cannot use the system if they test positive, and they can't apply anywhere else because nobody can run a full query without the consent. So if they choose to never register and they never leave the company, never have any issues, that's fine. The data will still get in there when the MRO or SAP or the employer enter the information as needed. It just may prohibit the driver from operating anymore.
What should we put on our employment form regarding registration?
It could be as simple as a question, have you already registered for the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse? You know, a statement in there saying, if hired by our company as a CDL driver, we are required to run a full query on new employment applicants. Have you already registered? If the answer is no, that's your decision whether you want to encourage them to register or move on. But it could be that simple, or you can have a separate form asking them if they registered. It's only for your convenience. There's no requirement for that. That is not part of the regulations as an application requirement. It's just something to speed up your application process, knowing if somebody's already registered.
Okay, that then there looks like the, oh, they're still coming in. Are we required to perform a query on a new owner-operator?
If you're the employer hiring owner-operators and they are operating under your authority, yes, you are. Every time you take them on, you will do it. Now, if you are a broker and they have their own operating authority, their own DOT number, no, they don't need to because they are responsible for their own drug and alcohol testing. It comes down to who's responsible for the drug and alcohol testing. If you are, then you have to run the query for every driver you bring on, as well as the annual.
How long does the process take once drivers register? For example, if we are potentially hiring someone and they were not registered, how long would we have to wait to see the full query?
Well, as far as I know, there's no delay in it. It's going to be how long it takes for them to validate themselves in the system. So they're going to set up their login.gov account. Once they get that set up, then they're going to go in and register in the clearinghouse, enter their CDL information. It should be available right away. Because think of it this way. If I enter information on a driver today, it's in the system. A driver then goes out and registers in login.gov. They register for the clearinghouse. Now it's going to pop up, there's something in here for you. So it should be almost immediate. It should be a live system.
Do we only have to do a yearly query on employees? We are owners, so do we have to do it on ourselves?
If you, as the owner or the driver, you can run your own queries, but you have to have a consortium or third-party administrator administering the test or administering the system when you may have the potential violation. So you would have to have somebody designated to report violations on the owners. But everybody else is driving for it. You can run them yourselves. You can run the annual. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is you can run ad hoc queries anytime you want. So say I'm driving for you. You get word that I've applied at Fred's Trucking down the street, and there may have been a problem. You can run an ad hoc anytime you want. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is people ask, why am I running an annual query? Well, the reason you run that is you don't know that I didn't apply to Fred's down the street and failed a drug test, and Fred didn't tell you. So this keeps your drivers from going out and applying and getting a positive test that you're not aware of. That's the purpose of the annual query anyway. But again, you can run more than one ad hoc query if just because you want to, or because you see a problem that you want to, or you heard about a problem, you want to see if there's anything in the system.
Okay, well, Dan, again, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out. This webinar recording will be available for replay at a later date. We'll send a link to that in our follow-up email. Thank you, everyone. Have a terrific and safe holiday season.
Thank you.